Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to have a look at bipolar analysis, which is both a technique for gathering data, but could also be used as a technique to present that data as well. So let's first actually have a look at what a bipolar analysis is. And the first thing you have to consider is where the technique is actually used, generally speaking, or more often than not. And it's where you have data which is subjective or nominal, for example, somebody's viewpoint or somebody's attitude towards an area, um, and you would like to quantify it, you'd like to turn it into a value. So we call data that you're not able to give a value to, we call that qualitative data. For example, we can see in this table here the smell of an area or the level of pollution. You could just by smelling it say that there is no odor at all. And if there was an unpleasant smell, you would smell that. But you can't turn that into a number because at the end of the day, it's just about whether an area smells or not. So that is qualitative data. Now, if you're interested in turning qualitative data into quantitative data, into numbers, then this is a technique that you can use. So it's a perfect technique for turning qualitative or subjective data into something that's got numbers and values and is more quantitative. Now, it's a little bit more than that because more typically, a scale starting at 0 or 1 is used and goes up in a positive way, and that is not a bipolar scale. And there's something very specific to a bipolar scale because it contains both negative scores and positive scores, as we can see here. And therefore, the person choosing to ascribe a score must choose either on the negative side or on the positive side, or actually indeed neutral. So, in this example, where an environmental quality study is being done for an area, the student would, for example, record the date, record the time they're doing the study and its actual location, and then they would make a decision about each of these categories for that area. And if they felt negatively in terms of without actually counting people, there were very few people, that would be seen as a low pedestrian count. They might score that as anywhere from a -2 to -1. Or if it was what they felt was average, a 0. Likewise, for some more subjective points where you can't count, for example, whether the buildings were well tended or not, they could give a score. Now, one of the real strengths of this methodology of gathering data is, first of all, it allows you the 0. Now, the 0 score is where can take a neutral position where you don't have an opinion. It also is used where you can see clear and obvious two sides to a description of an area or a street or any particular aspect that you're studying in geography. So you need to be able to think, for example, what is the opposite of noisy? Well, that would be quiet. What's the opposite of no greenery? Well, that would be some or a lot of greenery. And you don't need to keep your scores as -2 to +2. It can actually be -5 to +5 or -10 to +10. But what is important is you have the same amount on the positive as the minus. And the reason for that is because when we think about things subjectively, we tend to form positive or a negative opinion of those particular aspects we're thinking. And how negative or positive we feel about it allows us to then ascribe a score to that. Now, if you collect multiple categories, as we can see here, we've got more than 10 categories, you can build up a very detailed profile of an area by just whether you're scoring it consistently on the plus side or consistently on the minus, or actually, indeed, some areas might be a scattering of scores between the minuses and the pluses. Another important part of using a bipolar scaling system is to keep the scale relatively short. The bigger the scale is, the more likely it's going to be difficult to make precise scoring. Now, this system is very easy. You either feel very negative, somewhat negative, or you have no opinion, somewhat positive, or very positive. And you don't need to think too difficult or in too much detail. If this was a -10 to +10 scale, then what would be the difference between -6, -5, and -4 might be quite difficult for the person to decide. So then they're creating more difficulties for themselves when giving the scoring. So that is one way of doing a bipolar analysis. And we can see here it's very often used for environmental quality studies, which might be done by local authorities or planning departments or anybody interested in an area and the quality of that area, whether that's to do with the people, the buildings, the pollution, or whatever aspect they have to be studying. You can use this slightly varied system here, which is where certain categories are weighted more. So we can see that the quality of the paving in the road is given a much stronger weighting system than, for example, over here, whether there are cars parked on the road or not. So some things that influence an environment might be seen as being more impactful and given a bigger score. So this is a slightly different, this isn't strictly speaking bipolar, this is just a scoring system working from zero and scoring up the way, but with different categories given different weightings. Now, in terms of presenting the data, there's a variety of ways you can present your data. One of the more obvious ones is just a simple positive and negative bar graph. So anything scoring on the negative appears as a different color bar going down the way. It's also a perfect type of scenario data for using radial graphs, where you can create either 0 to 5 or a -2 to +2 for a range of different categories. And we can see here a very simple 4 sites where data has been gathered, and the overall score of the perception for those sites has been given for each of those. So if you've got a perception study that you've done in an area, and you've scored the area based on a range of people's perceptions about that area, and you've got a cumulative score for each of your sites, you can give it a total, and you can see you've got positive and negatives on this bar graph. Here we've got a slightly different presentation of it. So if you had a number of students or number of people scoring the quality of the coastal management at 6 locations, you could then see, you could put them all onto a graph. So this is the person who gave it the lowest, was a -3, but we had somebody up here giving it a 17 score. And if we put all of the people and we can see the range, we can see that this area over here was largely getting more positive scores with only quite low in the negative. Whereas we can see site 2 had the high in the negative along with site 5 and had much fewer people scoring in the positive. So once again, it's got a bipolar graph because it's got 2 different sides to it, a negative and a positive. Okay, so consider all of the possible uses of bipolar scoring. Think about the strengths. Why would you use it? So I'm just putting them on the screen. You could pause and note down some of those points if you're asked this in an exam. And here are some of the slightly more negative points to do with the scoring system, which you could also read through and take some notes on.